Over the endless Pacific, the night is total. No stars. No horizon. No sound but the steady hum of engines pushing through humid air. A Japanese G-4M bomber drifts through the black void, its silver belly catching a faint shimmer of moonlight between clouds. Inside, the pilot keeps one hand on the throttle, the other resting on the worn edge of his map. His eyes flicker between the gauges, altitude steady, speed constant, and then back to the infinite dark ahead. He has flown this route dozens of times. From Truk to Rabaul, from Rabaul to the Marianas. The night has always protected him. American radar, he believes, is crude, their night fighters clumsy, blind without the sun. The Imperial pilots call the darkness their mother. And tonight that mother feels near. He knows the risks. The war is turning. The Americans are everywhere now, new carriers, new planes, new bombs. But up here, above the Pacific, wrapped in clouds and silence, he feels untouchable. Invisible. Below, the ocean glimmers faintly, like a sheet of ink reflecting a dying moon. It's the kind of night that hides everything, mistakes, fear, even death. The co-pilot checks his watch. 2 hours to target. The radio hisses and pops with empty static. They've flown this route before, guided only by compass and instinct. There are no searchlights, no fighters, no alarms. Just the slow rhythm of the engines and the soft creak of the fuselage expanding in the cold air. And yet, something feels different. The pilot doesn't know why. A pressure in his ears. A whisper of turbulence where there should be none. He glances again into the darkness, searching for a shape that isn't there. The altimeter ticks down slightly, he adjusts. Nothing on the horizon. Nothing at all. Then, in the space between heartbeats, something shifts. A flash, not from below, not from ahead, but from behind. A single streak of light cuts through the void. Then another. And another. Tracers rip across the bomber's tail. One engine erupts in a roar of flame. Metal screams, glass shatters, and the cabin fills with smoke and panic. The pilot jerks the controls, but the bomber rolls violently, fire spinning across the night. They never saw the attacker. Not a glint of light. Not a sound. The co-pilot's last words vanish in static. The bomber plunges into the sea, leaving only a smear of fire that flickers once, then fades into darkness. High above, a shadow drifts silently away. Black as the night itself. Its twin engines purr at half throttle. No lights. No markings visible to the human eye. Inside, 3 men sit surrounded by the faint glow of phosphorescent instruments. One speaks quietly. Target confirmed. Splash 1 Betty. The pilot nods. Good work, radar. The radar operator, the observer, stares into the circular green scope, watching the last echo fade to nothing. It wasn't luck. It was technology. This is the story of the P-61 Black Widow. America's night hunter. The first aircraft built to seek and kill in total darkness. A plane born from desperation, designed to fight a kind of war no one had fought before. A war without light, without warning, without mercy. By the summer of 1944, the night over the Pacific had changed. What once belonged to Japan was now ruled by something new, something unseen. Because while one side trusted instinct, the other trusted the invisible. The invisible one. For decades, war had been fought in daylight. Dogfights above clouds, bombers in formation, pilots spotting each other miles away. But as World War II dragged on, the battlefield moved into the shadows. Technology was advancing faster than human senses could follow. By 1942, the Americans were losing men not just to bullets, but to the dark. The Japanese used it as a weapon. Their bombers struck at night, their supply runs slipped unseen past Allied patrols. The night sky was a sanctuary, a place where even radar searchlights from ships struggled to find a target. It became clear, whoever could master the night would control the war. But how do you fight what you can't see? In Washington, in laboratories and hangars across the country, engineers were already chasing the answer. The British had given America a secret, a new kind of radar small enough to fit inside an airplane's nose. It used microwaves, not long radio waves, allowing sharper detection. The Americans refined it, adapted it, and named it the SCR-720A. Its power was astonishing. It could detect a bomber-sized target 5 miles away, through clouds, through rain, through the blackest night. But a radar is useless without a hunter to wield it. That's where Northrop came in. In 1940, Jack Northrop's company was still young, known for unorthodox designs and experimental engineering. When the U.S. Army asked for a purpose-built night fighter, Northrop promised something radical: a twin-engine machine big enough to carry the new radar, fast enough to chase bombers and agile enough to fight them. It would have 3 crewmen, a pilot, a gunner, and a radar observer. It would have 4 20mm cannons, and a dorsal turret that could rotate a full circle. And its name, chosen almost as a warning, was the Black Widow. Because once you flew into its web, you did not come back. The first prototypes were monstrous, long bulbous noses for radar, massive tail booms, and thick wings built for stability in night air. The early test pilots called it the flying tank. But it could climb fast, turn tight, and carry enough firepower to tear apart a bomber in seconds. At its heart pulsed the SR-720A radar, the eyes of the Widow. Inside that glowing cathode tube, invisible radio waves swept the sky, bouncing off distant targets and painting them as moving dots of light. For the first time in history, men could see through darkness. But in 1942, not everyone believed it would work. Many pilots mocked the idea. A machine that could find an enemy you couldn't see with your eyes? It sounded like science fiction. Others feared it. They said it would make killing too easy, too cold, too mechanical. Yet by 1943, desperation had silenced doubt. American bases in the Pacific were being hit nightly. Japan's twin-engine bombers struck from the dark, killing without warning. Searchlights and anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into clouds. The enemy had learned to vanish after every raid. The U.S. needed eyes. The P-61 would become them. The first operational units trained in Florida and California, learning to read radar scopes, to coordinate between pilot and observer in perfect silence. They practiced intercepts on friendly bombers, chasing faint blips across empty sky until the system worked like instinct. When the first squadron deployed to the Pacific in mid-1944, the Japanese pilots didn't even know such a weapon existed. They soon would. On the ground, mechanics called it the Widowmaker, partly for its name, partly because the engines were temperamental and the plane was unforgiving on takeoff. But once airborne, it was unmatched. With a wingspan of 66 feet and twin Pratt & Whitney or 2800s, it could fly at nearly 370 miles per hour, fast enough to overtake any Japanese bomber. Each crew had its rhythm, the pilot flying blind through darkness, the radar operator whispering range and bearing, the gunner waiting in silence. They trusted instruments, not eyes. 5 miles out, contact. Range decreasing. Bearing 030. 3 miles, still closing. He's big, likely a Betty. 1 mile, visual soon. Maintain speed. Then the moment of truth, a silhouette ahead, faint against the clouds. The gunner squeezes the trigger. Cannons roar. The bomber erupts in fire. The radar scope goes blank again. Silence. In that void, men felt both triumph and something colder. They had hunted in the dark and won. But they had done it without ever seeing the face of the enemy. By late 1944, reports from the Pacific told a new story: Japanese aircrews refusing to fly at night. Rumors spread that ghost planes prowled the skies, killing without warning. Some pilots believed the Americans had trained bats, or that the devil himself guarded their routes. They never knew the truth. It wasn't luck. It was radar. The same radar that now guided bombers over Europe, that watched coastlines, that listened for whispers of enemy movement thousands of miles away. War had become a contest of innovation, each invention outpacing the last. But no invention was as unsettling as this one, because it made human vision obsolete. For the men who flew the P-61, it was power unlike anything they'd known. And with that power came an unease that lingered long after the shooting stopped. The Black Widow would go on to fight from the Marianas to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Its radar could track, lock, and kill before its crew ever saw the enemy. And the pilots of Japan, once so sure of their safety in the dark, would learn too late what hunted them there. By the time they realized, the night already belonged to someone else. If you love untold stories of World War II innovation, stories of how fear gave birth to invention and how darkness became a weapon, subscribe and step into the night with us. Because this is only the beginning of what the P-61 Black Widow would do when the lights went out. In the early months of 1941, before America had even entered the war, a handful of engineers at Northrop's modest facility in Hawthorne, California, worked long nights on blueprints that no one else believed in. Their hangars smelled of oil, sweat, and fear of failure. Each drawing they pinned to the wall felt like a wager against time itself. The world was changing faster than paper could capture. Jack Northrop, the company's founder, stood over the drafting tables with his sleeves rolled up. He had built gliders and bombers before, but this was different. The Air Corps wanted something no one had ever made. A plane that could fight in total darkness, guided not by eyes, but by waves of invisible energy. To build a machine that could see without seeing, that was the challenge. He studied reports from Europe. British Beaufighters hunting German bombers over the channel, their crude radar systems flickering like ghosts. The RAF had proven that radar interception was possible. Barely. But their planes were slow, unstable, and too cramped to carry real firepower. Northrop's design would change that. His night fighter would be bigger, faster, and smarter. It would also be terrifying. From the first sketches, the Black Widow was a creature of paradox. Two massive engines stretched out along long, narrow booms, joined by a central pod for the crew. The nose, bulbous, empty, would hold the radar antenna, a strange, faceless organ that gave the aircraft its uncanny silhouette. The wings were thick and strong, with an arc that gave the plane the grace of a predator in slow flight. The Air Corps called it the P-61. But the men who saw it on the assembly floor gave it another name. They said it looked like something that hunted dreams. When the first prototype rolled out in 1942, under a gray California dawn, even its own engineers were silent for a moment. It was enormous, 66 feet of matte black metal, more bomber than fighter, yet sleek as a blade. The test pilot, Vance Breeze, climbed into the cockpit for the maiden flight. The engines ignited with a deep, rolling thunder that rattled windows miles away. As the wheels left the runway, the Black Widow rose into a misty sky, its form merging with the clouds like a shadow learning to breathe. For 45 minutes, it flew flawlessly. Smooth, steady, alive. But flight was only half the story. Inside its nose sat the heart of the new age, the SEER-720A radar. Developed by the engineers at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, this system could detect an enemy aircraft up to 6 miles away and guide the pilot directly toward it. It was the most advanced radar in the world. The early operators called it the Green Eye. They trained for months to read its soft glow, circular screens where blips appeared like tiny sparks, pulsing faintly as the distance closed. Learning to interpret those signals was an art form. Every flicker meant altitude, every echo meant speed. One mistake could send them chasing shadows or worse, colliding with their prey in the dark. During those first tests, mistakes happened often. The radar picked up echoes from the ground, from clouds, even from their own wingtips. Engineers joked about ghosts haunting the system. Pilots cursed when they closed in on targets that turned out to be weather fronts or flocks of birds. The machine worked, but it was temperamental, like an animal that needed to be tamed. Still, each success felt miraculous. A pilot could now follow nothing but a voice in his ear, the calm tone of his radar operator calling range and bearing, and emerge out of the night directly behind a target. For the first time in history, darkness no longer belonged to chance. It belonged to calculation. By late 1943, the P-61 had entered limited production. Every part of it was engineered for its singular mission. The fuselage was coated in matte black paint to absorb moonlight. Its 420mm Hispano cannons sat in the belly, lined up like the fangs of a beast. Above them, a remote-controlled turret could spin 360 degrees, controlled electrically by the gunner from behind the cockpit. At full speed, it could reach nearly 370 miles per hour, climb to 33,000 feet, and stay aloft for 8 hours. It was, by all accounts, one of the most advanced aircraft of its time, yet few outside of its crews even knew it existed. While the war raged in Europe, the first squadrons trained in secret across America. Pilots learned to fly in total blackout conditions, guided only by radar coordinates. Instructors warned them, "You'll never see your enemy until he's already dying." Many found the idea unsettling. Combat had always been visual, man against man, face to face. Now it was invisible, mechanical, remote. The P-61 was redefining what it meant to fight. In the dark, human instinct became obsolete. By the time the first units shipped out to the Pacific, the men had learned to trust the machines more than themselves. The radar operators, often young, often underestimated, became the true eyes of the aircraft. They sat hunched over their screens, headphones clamped tight, murmuring instructions into the pilot's ear. Turn right 2 degrees. Maintain altitude. Target ahead, closing fast. Between them grew a kind of silent faith. The pilot never questioned. The radar operator never hesitated. Together they became a single organism, one part flesh, one part signal. The Pacific would test the union like no battlefield before. When the Black Widow first arrived at Guadalcanal in mid-1944, it seemed almost alien among the weathered Corsairs and P-38s parked on the coral runways. Ground crews stared at it with suspicion. Too big. Too black. Too strange. They had no idea what it could do. But the men who flew it understood. They knew the night was about to change. The first combat sorties began quietly. The Japanese were still flying their nightly raids, confident as ever that no American could touch them in the dark. Their bombers, the G-4M Betty, the Ki-49 Helen, cruised between islands, guided only by the stars. On one of those nights, a Black Widow from the 6th Night Fighter Squadron took off from Saipan under a moonless sky. The crew, pilot Lieutenant Dale Haberman, gunner Sergeant Glenn Jacobson, and radar operator Lieutenant Raymond Mooney, climbed to 20,000 feet, instruments glowing faintly in the cockpit. Mooney's scope flickered. Contact. Range 6 miles. Bearing 085. Haberman adjusted his course. Copy. Closing. The blip moved steadily toward the center of the screen. Mooney's voice stayed calm. 4 miles. 3. 2. Then, visual. The outline of a Japanese bomber appeared against the stars, just a faint shape. Haberman moved in, throttle steady. When the range closed to 200 yards, Jacobson opened fire. The cannons roared. The target burst into flame, spiraling downward into the ocean. It was over in seconds. That night the Japanese never even knew what hit them. Word spread quickly across the Pacific. Crews whispered about an American plane that could see in the dark. Pilots called it Yami no Shinigami, the god of death in the night. In just a few weeks, the P-61 had transformed the balance of fear. But success came at a cost. For every victory, the crews felt the weight of what they had become: hunters who never saw their prey, executioners guided by electronic ghosts. Some wrote in their journals that they dreamed of glowing green dots long after missions ended, each blip a soul they had taken. Technology had made them gods, but it had also made them numb. And yet, the war demanded results. Commanders praised the P-61 as a triumph of engineering. Reports flooded in from New Guinea, the Marianas, and the Philippines. Nightly interceptions, bombers destroyed, morale restored. The Japanese tried to adapt, changing altitudes, flying lower, scattering formations. Nothing worked. The radar saw them all. By autumn, the enemy began to abandon night raids altogether. The Pacific's darkness, once their shield, had turned against them. Still, the Widow's crews knew this was only the beginning. The war was moving closer to Japan itself, and the Black Widow would soon follow. As one pilot later recalled, "When we arrived, the Japanese owned the night. When we left, it belonged to us." But for those who flew the Widow, the real battle wasn't always out there, in the dark skies above the islands. Sometimes, it was in their own minds, the quiet reckoning of men who realized that the future of warfare no longer needed the human eye. Because once the radar came alive, once its green glow filled the cockpit, they stopped seeing with their hearts. They saw with machines. And the machines never blinked. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had become a ceaseless exchange of shadows and fire. The islands that once gleamed under the sun were now ruled by the night. Every dusk brought a new pattern of danger: radar pings from distant ships, the low hum of engines drifting over the ocean, the smell of aviation fuel mixing with salt and rain. For the Japanese, night used to mean safety. Their bombers lifted from hidden airstrips on the Marianas, the Philippines, or Formosa, flying low and slow, trusting the moon and silence to protect them. The Americans had nothing that could follow them into the dark. Until the Black Widow arrived. When the first P-61s were deployed to Saipan, the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy noticed something strange. Their aircraft didn't always return. No radio calls, no distress signals. They simply vanished into the Pacific night. The pattern was too perfect to be coincidence. Something was hunting them. At first, Japanese intelligence believed the Americans had deployed an advanced ground radar network, or hidden fighters guided by radio. They couldn't imagine that radar was now inside the plane itself. They didn't yet understand that darkness had turned traitor. Night after night, the Black Widows of the 6th and 418th Night Fighter Squadrons took off just before midnight. Each mission followed the same ritual. The ground crew checked the radome for salt and moisture, wiped down the radar screens and sealed the cockpit canopies. Inside, the crew sat in silence as the engines warmed. Two massive Pratt & Whitney R2800s, the same that powered the P-47 Thunderbolt. The roar of those engines was the last sound they would hear before the night swallowed them. Once airborne, all lights went dark. The only glow came from the instruments and the pale green radar scope. The radar operator sat alone in the tail section, eyes fixed on that circle of light, tracing the faint arcs of movement. When a blip appeared, he didn't shout. He spoke evenly, rhythmically, as though reciting coordinates from another world. Contact. Range 9 miles. Bearing 180. Altitude decreasing. The pilot would turn the aircraft without question. The gunner would prepare the turret, eyes straining through the gun sight, searching for something, anything, in the void. Then the operator's voice again. Range 6 miles. Target steady. No jamming. Each mile closer, the blip grew stronger. Sweat pooled in the operator's collar. He adjusted the gain control, reading every echo, every flicker. 2 miles. You should have visual in 10 seconds. And suddenly, there it was. A faint silhouette, like a moth against a lamp. A Japanese G4M Betty, cruising home after a raid on Tinian. The Black Widow slid silently behind it. The gunner's finger curled around the trigger. 4 20mm cannons and 4.50 caliber machine guns erupted in unison. A chain of fire tore through the night sky. The Betty exploded midair, a bloom of orange and red, then nothing. No parachutes. No survivors. Only the echo of the Widow's engines fading into the black. The Japanese never saw it coming. At first they called it the Phantom. Crews swore they were attacked by something invisible, something that struck without warning and disappeared before they could react. Rumors spread across the bases at Truk and Rabaul, stories of a black aircraft that flew without lights, without mercy. Mechanics painted white charms on the noses of their bombers, charms meant to ward off evil spirits. But it wasn't a spirit. It was a machine built by men who no longer needed to see their enemy to destroy him. The Black Widow's reputation grew with every mission. Lieutenant Dale Haberman scored kill after kill, using radar to ambush bombers over the Marianas. Captain Lee Kendall became known for shooting down 3 enemy aircraft in a single night, a record that no pilot before him had achieved without ever seeing the sky illuminated by dawn. The Widow's crews began to describe their work in cold, mechanical language. Acquired. Locked. Engaged. Destroyed. It was warfare distilled to pure data. The radar didn't lie, didn't panic, didn't hesitate. It only told the truth, the coordinates of life and death. Yet behind that precision lay something human, something the manuals never mentioned. The men inside those black fuselages felt the strain of hunting ghosts. They flew through storms and crosswinds, trusting instruments that could fail at any second. They watched Japanese flares drift through the clouds, tiny suns burning out over the sea, and wondered if somewhere, a Betty crew was praying in the dark as they once had. For the radar operators, the loneliness was worse. They saw everything first, every approach, every hit. They were the ones who said break left when a target turned, fire now when it was time to kill. They guided death with a steady voice. And when it was over, the radar screen went blank again as if nothing had happened. One operator wrote in his logbook, "We call them blips. Little dots on a green glass. But every dot is a man, a crew, a story that ends when I say the word." That was the paradox of the Widow. Its greatest weapon was also its curse. By late 1944, the Black Widow had reshaped the Pacific Air War. Japanese commanders began ordering their bombers to fly higher, beyond 25,000 feet, hoping to slip above the radar's reach. But the Widow's radar could see them even there. They tried low-altitude runs, hugging the waves to blend with sea clutter, but the operators adapted, tuning their filters, tracking even the faintest echoes. The Americans were no longer chasing the enemy. The enemy was running from the night itself. At Iwo Jima, the Widow covered the beaches during the invasion, intercepting bombers before they could strike the landing zones. At Okinawa, they guarded the fleet from kamikaze attacks after sundown, shooting down attackers before they even reached the horizon. Everywhere the Widow flew, it created a strange silence, the silence of fear on the other side of the sky. One Japanese pilot, captured after bailing out, described it this way: "It was as if the dark turned against us. We flew through the same stars, but the night was no longer ours." For American crews, victory brought no comfort. They had seen what the future looked like: war without faces, guided by machines. Some felt pride in what they achieved. Others felt a kind of emptiness, as if the soul of combat had been stripped away. Captain Kendall once told a reporter years later, "When I fired, I wasn't fighting another man. I was shooting at a dot on a radar screen." The sky never looked the same after that. The Widow had changed everything, not just the tactics but the psychology of war. It was the first whisper of the machine age, where technology would soon think, aim, and decide faster than the people inside it. And yet, in 1944, for a brief, haunted moment, the machine still needed them. The men who trusted it, feared it, and carried it into the dark. Because the Black Widow wasn't only America's night hunter. It was a mirror, showing the world what it would become when war learned to see without eyes. In Europe, the night had long been owned by the Germans. Since the Blitz, the Luftwaffe's night fighters had ruled the darkness. The Bf-110s and Ju-88s, guided by their own radar operators, stalking British bombers over the continent. The Germans called it Nachtjagd, the night hunt. And for years they had been the predators. But by the end of 1944, the tide had shifted. The once feared Kammhuber line, that network of radar stations, flak zones, and night interceptors, lay in ruins. Allied bombers now struck at will. And above the silent forests of France, the Americans brought a new kind of hunter. The P-61 Black Widow arrived in Europe quietly, almost unnoticed. Its crews were young, its mission still experimental. The British had their Mosquito, light, fast, deadly. But the Widow was something else entirely: heavier, stronger, and equipped with the most advanced airborne radar in the world, the SR-720A. Its dome-like nose contained what pilots called the third crewman, an electronic eye that could see through fog, smoke, and pitch-black night for miles ahead. It was a secret too powerful to reveal in the open. Even within Allied circles, few truly understood how it worked. The crews of the 422nd and 425th Night Fighter Squadrons flew from muddy airfields in France, intercepting German aircraft that still dared to attack under the cover of darkness. They hunted V-1 flying bombs, the so-called buzz bombs, that screamed toward London. They chased Ju-88 night fighters, desperate Luftwaffe crews trying to flee to safer skies. The Widow could spot them long before any human eye could. On one cold December night, during the Battle of the Bulge, a P-61 named Lady in the Dark patrolled near Liège. The weather was miserable, clouds thick as tar, freezing rain icing the wings. Visibility, 0. But on the radar screen the operator saw a flicker, a ghostly signal weaving slowly across the scope. He leaned forward. "Contact, range 6 miles, bearing 210. The pilot, Lieutenant Lee Kendall, banked the Widow left. "Got him?" he asked. The operator's voice was steady. "Affirmative. Looks like a single-engine aircraft, maybe a Ju-87 or a Focke-Wulf." The blip moved. Then another appeared behind it, two flying in formation. Kendall smiled thinly. "Let's introduce ourselves." He eased the throttles forward. The Widow climbed above the clouds, then slipped back down, invisible against the black sky. When they broke through the mist, the radar operator whispered, "Visual at 12 o'clock. Two dark shapes ahead." Their engines glowed faintly red. German pilots returning from a night strike. The Widow crept closer, 500 yards then 200. The rear gunner adjusted his turret, crosshairs aligning on the tail of the lead aircraft. Fire. The cannons roared. One German plane erupted instantly, flames spiraled into the clouds. The second banked hard, diving for the forest below. The Widow followed through the descent, locked again by radar. Another burst, another bloom of light in the storm. When Kendall returned to base before dawn, his crew was silent. They hadn't seen a single enemy face. Only echoes on a screen. The Luftwaffe's night aces, men like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer and Helmut Lent, had once been masters of nocturnal combat. But by late 1944 their tactics were collapsing. Their radar, the Liechtenstein SN-2, was powerful, but primitive compared to the American system. It required large antenna arrays that slowed their aircraft and gave them away to Allied eyes. The Black Widow, with its sleek nose and hidden dish, could approach unseen, unlit, guided by that unblinking green radar eye. In the darkness over the Rhine, technology had become the new camouflage. But as the Widow hunted the last remnants of the Luftwaffe, another kind of battle was being fought, a moral one. Among the crews, unease began to grow. They were no longer fighting men in equal sight. They were executing blips, invisible targets that never even knew they were being stalked. Radar had stripped away the drama of dogfighting, the heroics of the open sky. War had become mathematical. Contact. Range decreasing. Target destroyed. And that was it. Some pilots embraced it. They saw it as progress, survival through precision. Others feared what it meant. If machines could hunt, what would come next? As the Allies crossed into Germany, the Widow's missions shifted. They hunted retreating columns by night, strafed rail lines, and guided bombers through fog and storms. Sometimes their radar picked up strange echoes on the ground, moving dots that turned out to be trucks or convoys or fleeing soldiers. The operators joked that they could see everything but the future. In the final weeks of the war, Lady in the Dark became a legend. On the night of August 14, 1945, just hours before Japan's surrender, she intercepted a Japanese Ki-44 Tojo over Aishima. The two aircraft tangled briefly, but the enemy pilot panicked and crashed while trying to evade. No bullets fired. The kill was recorded as the last aerial victory of World War II. A night fighter had ended a global war, fitting perhaps for an age that began in the dark and ended with light brighter than the sun over Hiroshima. When the war finally fell silent, the P-61s returned to bases littered with ghosts. Many were dismantled or scrapped within months, their technology too advanced, their role already evolving. But for those who had flown them, the memories lingered like the echo of radar pings that would never fade. One pilot years later said quietly, "We turned the night into a weapon. And once we did, we could never turn it back." The Widow's radar became the foundation for post-war designs. The F-82 Twin Mustang, the F-94 Starfire, and eventually the F-86D Sabre. Every jet that flew in darkness carried a trace of the Widow's legacy, the belief that the machine could see better, think faster, and strike first. But technology never stops where men intend it to. The same radar principles that found bombers in 1944 would one day guide missiles, satellites, and drones. The unseen world that the Widow revealed would become the modern battlefield, a realm of signals, reflections, and invisible warfare. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the memory was darker still. Many had never even known what destroyed them. To them, the P-61 was not a plane, but a myth, a black ghost that moved through the clouds, striking without sound or light. One diary recovered from a downed pilot near Okinawa contained only a few lines. "We cannot see them. We cannot fight them. The night has betrayed us." Those words captured what every enemy of the Widow had felt, that sickening dread of realizing the sky itself was no longer safe. The P-61 had done more than win battles. It had rewritten the rules of perception, of fear, of control. The darkness was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. By the war's end, fewer than 700 Black Widows were ever built. They never had the fame of Mustangs or Spitfires. But in the history of warfare, they marked a turning point, the moment when man began to share the hunt with his own creation. The Widow was not just a machine of war. It was the threshold of something new. A vision of the future, cold, precise, and unseen. And though the world moved on, the radar's hum still lingered, faint and steady, like the heartbeat of the night itself. When peace finally returned, it came quietly, like the hush that follows thunder. The airfields that once roared with engines stood silent. P-61s, still painted in their wartime black, sat forgotten under the sun. Their radar screens cold. Their propellers still. The men who had flown them drifted home, uncertain what to do with the memories that followed. 4 years afterward, the Widow existed only in the whispers of veterans and the fading pages of declassified reports. There were no parades for the night fighters. No anthems for the ones who hunted in silence. They had fought in a war that most of the world never saw, a war of invisible lines, of ghosts on glass, of fear without faces. Yet, in that unseen war, a revolution had begun. The Black Widow's radar, the SER-720A, was more than an invention. It was a threshold. It transformed darkness from mystery into data, from terror into geometry. For the first time in history, a machine could see where man could not. That simple truth, that a circuit could outsee a human eye, changed everything. Before the Widow, pilots flew by instinct, by reflex, by the glimmer of light off their enemy's wings. After it they flew by echo, by faith in the invisible. And faith in war is a dangerous thing. In the years after 1945, radar technology exploded across the globe. From the ashes of Europe to the laboratories of America, engineers refined what the Widow had proven possible. They shrank the screens, sharpened the images, increased the range. Soon radar was not just in planes, it was on ships, in towers, in missiles that could track their targets without eyes or conscience. The Black Widow had given the world a new sense, one that could never be turned off again. In the night skies over Korea, new interceptors like the F-94 Starfire and F-86D Sabre carried the descendant of that same radar heart. In Vietnam, radar guided the Phantom, the Thud, and the Crusader through storms and darkness. And beyond the Earth itself, in the cold silence of space, satellites would one day use radar to watch the entire planet, every coastline, every storm, every war. All of it began with that faint green blip on a P-61 screen, somewhere over the Pacific in 1944. But for those who had been there, technology was never just a marvel, it was a burden. Many of the Widow's crews struggled to explain what they had felt. The sensation of watching a target appear from nothing, grow brighter, and vanish again, knowing in that instant that someone's life had ended far below. They weren't celebrated as heroes. They were instruments of a new kind of warfare, detached, distant, efficient. One that demanded precision, not passion. Discipline, not rage. Some found peace in that detachment. Others did not. In interviews years later, former radar operators tried to put it into words. It wasn't like shooting down a plane. It was like erasing it. You didn't see them. You didn't hear them. You just watched a blip disappear and that was it. We fought the war of the future and we didn't even know it. Their confessions echoed the paradox of the Black Widow itself. A machine built to make war more humane by ending it faster, yet one that made killing feel mechanical, invisible, and cold. That paradox would haunt the rest of the 20th century. By the 1950s, the last P-61s were stripped, stored, or scrapped. Some were converted for weather research, their radar still probing the skies for storms instead of bombers. A few were lost to time, buried under dust and indifference. Only a handful survived. One, painstakingly restored decades later, stands today in a museum in Virginia. Its black paint gleams under the lights, its wings stretching like the shadow of a memory that refuses to fade. Visitors walk past it without knowing what they're seeing. They don't hear the hum of its radar, or the whisper of its crew speaking through headsets in the dark. They don't feel the tension of those long, silent hunts over the Pacific. They only see a relic. But for the men who once flew it, that black fuselage was more than metal. It was the edge of human perception, the point where imagination met fear and fear became power. The Japanese who survived those hunts rarely spoke of the Widow. To them, it had been a supernatural force, the manifestation of a war they could no longer comprehend. One officer who had served on Formosa recalled years later, "We used to say if you die in the daylight you die like a soldier. But if you die in the night, you die by the Widow's hand." It wasn't just defeat. It was humiliation, to be killed by something you could not see, by a machine that needed no courage, no eyes, no mercy. The Widow had done what no weapon before it had achieved. It had erased the line between man and machine on the battlefield. And yet, for all its cold precision, there was still humanity in the way its crews remembered it. They remembered the smell of oil and canvas inside the fuselage, the low growl of the engines before takeoff, the strange beauty of the radar screen, that circle of green light pulsing like a living thing. They remembered the fear too. The fear of losing radar contact over open sea. The fear of landing on a blacked-out airstrip after a mission, praying that the faint signal from the ground was friendly. And sometimes, the fear of what they had become, men who hunted by pulse and echo instead of sight and instinct. War had forced them to evolve faster than they were ready. The P-61 was the proof that innovation born from desperation could change the course of history. It was designed in the darkest years of the war, when the Allies were bleeding and hope seemed dim. But out of that desperation came a revelation, that technology could conquer fear. In that sense, the Black Widow was not just a weapon. It was a message. That progress, no matter how costly, is inevitable. That once humanity learns to see the unseen, it will never go blind again. In the end, the widow left behind no grand monuments, no statues of pilots frozen in heroism. Only stories whispered by old men who once flew through darkness and lived to see the dawn. They remember how the radar hummed, how the operator's voice guided them through the void, how the world below slept while they fought a war the rest of humanity would never witness. Their war ended, but the world they created did not. It lives in every guided missile, every drone, every satellite that watches from the sky. Every echo that bounces back to a screen somewhere is the descendant of that first trembling signal inside the widow's nose. We live in the age that began with her. An age where nothing is truly hidden anymore. Sometimes at night, when the air is still and the stars are dim, old pilots say they can still hear it, the faint rumble of twin engines far above, circling in silence. The last ghost of the Pacific War. The Black Widow watching the night it once ruled. A machine born from fear, forged in secrecy and remembered in silence. It saw what no human could. It hunted what could not be seen. And in doing so, it taught mankind the most dangerous lesson of all, that in war knowledge is the deadliest weapon of all. If you believe history's darkest stories still have lessons to teach, subscribe, and keep your eyes on the horizon. Because sometimes even now the night still watches back.